This is my 106th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge, and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is another kit build of Ratio Trackside Plastic Kit 503 Platform/Ground Signal Box. Now, I've had my problems with ratio kits in the past, specifically in respect of poorly made parts and unreasonable assembly requirements. Too many ratio kits that I've worked with have had severe problems, so much so that some time ago I simply said that I wouldn't be working with ratio kits anymore. But I wanted to build 2 signal boxes for my shelf layout, and I wanted to use kits that I hadn't done before rather than just repeating the same thing over. I've built every signal box kit that Metcalfe make. I've built the Super Quick signal box kit. I've used the Hornby signal boxes. So I looked for other things. And I found 2 plastic signal box kits in stock locally here in Canada, the Ratio 503 kit that I'll be building in this video and a Wills kit for a timber signal box that I'll be building in the near future. I was able to check out some info on these 2 kits before buying, and they both looked quite promising. I saw pictures of built-up versions of both kits that looked very nice, and I was able to get some sense of what kind of parts the kits would provide, enough to give me a sense that these kits wouldn't likely present the kind of issues that have made me unhappy with Ratio and Wills kits in the past. So far as Wills kits are concerned, and this one in particular, I'll leave that until I do a build video on that. So now let's just focus on the Ratio kit. Spoiler alert. After building this, my general conclusion is that this is a high quality kit and I would recommend it. My only reservation would be that the build is not simple and demands a considerable degree of patience, care and precision, so it wouldn't be suitable for beginning modelers. Comparing this kit, for example, to something like the Airfix Daypole trackside kits, I'd say that this Ratio kit requires modelling skills not just a degree higher, but a couple of degrees higher than the Airfix Daypole kits. The kit came packaged in a sturdy box, always a good starting point, and quite necessary in the case of this kit. I don't think the multitude of fine parts in this kit would have survived shipping just in a bag. Here are the contents of this kit unpackaged. 9 sprues of plastic parts in various colours, counting the base with its included parts as a sprue. A rectangular sheet of clear acetate for glazing, a piece of brass wire from which handrails can be made, a small sheet of decals, a double-sided sheet of instructions, and paper parts for the interior printed on the packaging lid insert. Here's a close-up just of the plastic parts. The use of many colours is an essential feature of this kit, as it allows the kit to produce a result that will look quite realistic even without painting. And indeed I went with that approach, trusting the coloured kit parts to produce an appropriate result, except in the case of a few detail parts that definitely required painting. The decal sheet basically just provides lettering, and I didn't actually use it, preferring to create a name board for the box by printing from my PC. Here's the front of the instruction sheet with the paper parts that came inside the lid. Because those paper parts might pass unnoticed, the other side of the paper lid insert had interior overleaf stamped on it to encourage you to look. Here's the back of the instruction sheet. This was a wee bit inconvenient, as the detailed diagrams for assembling the cabin walls are on the back of the sheet, and you really need to consult those diagrams with care, whereas the verbal instructions for assembling the cabin walls are on the front of the sheet. So whilst you're assembling the cabin walls, a fairly long and fiddly process, you're constantly flipping the sheet over back and forth. Here are the detailed verbal instructions for assembling the cabin walls from the front of the instruction sheet. I had to read these several times and peer at the parts quite a bit before I felt that I understood what was intended. Another little niggle with this kit is that the instructions always refer to parts by numbers, but there are no numbers actually on the parts or the sprues. so the numbers are of no help in identifying the parts. They do help in correlating the verbal instructions and the diagrams on the instruction sheet. Sorting out the business of the Type 19 and Type 20 windows in particular confused me at first. Here's the window frame sprue. The T's mentioned in the instructions are on those flat parts at the outside of the sprue. All of the window frames have a T next to them. This is just to indicate which way up they're supposed to go. The distinction is very subtle, and I'm not entirely sure that I actually got all of them the right way up, given all of the other things I was trying to deal with as I was attaching them. Here's the diagram indicating how the front panel of the box cabin is to be assembled. This offers the best key as to distinguishing between the Type 19 and the Type 20 windows. The 19s have sort of flanges protruding from their sides, whilst the 20s are just flat frames. You need to note carefully from the O's and X's where the 19 and 20 type window frames are supposed to go. Because there are no part numbers on the parts themselves of the sprues, you need to use the shape of the parts as shown in that diagram to find the correct parts. Based on that, it appears that the part at top right on the green sprue is the frame for the cabin front, and the two parts at bottom left on the beige sprue would be the timbers for the cabin front. Separating the parts of this kit from the sprues requires considerable care, as there are many robust attachment points and the parts themselves are often very delicate. On the plus side, the parts were generally extremely well cast, with fine detail and almost no flash. But cutting them out and cleaning up the remains of the attachment points was quite challenging. I put a new blade into my craft knife before starting. Even so, I often cut the attachment points by making multiple passes with the knife, gradually cutting a deeper groove until I got all the way through. I did this because I feared if I tried to cut through in a single pass, the part would probably break. It did help that the plastic used in this kit was slightly flexible. If the plastic had been rigid and brittle, I don't think it would have been possible to get some of the parts off the sprues without breaking them. Here's the frame for the cabin front off the sprue, but still needing quite a bit more cleaning up. Here are the frame and timber parts for the cabin front on the instruction sheet next to the relevant diagram. So this is what we're doing, gluing the timber parts in from the back of the frame, making sure that you get the frame the right way round, so effectively you have a timber wall with coloured framing without any actual painting, though of course you could paint the timber and or the frames if you wanted to. Next, the window frames need to be glued in place. The instructions say to glue the Type 19 frames first from the back. These seem to be barely large enough to reach from the bottom to the top of where they needed to be fitted, making them tricky to glue in place. Then the Type 20 window frames are glued in place from the front. These seem to fit more readily. The instructions said to do the 19s first and then the 20s, but I wondered if it wouldn't have been better to do the 20s first, as these seem to fit into place more clearly. Next, I glazed the windows for that section. I did wonder if I should have glazed the frames before gluing them in place. The instructions actually say to do all of the glazing after the cabin walls have been glued together, which definitely didn't seem like a good idea to me. There's no pre-marking of the glazing, you just have to cut pieces to size yourself. The instructions give dimensions in millimeters, which seem to be about right. Here's the cabin front seen from the inside with the glazing in place. And here's that completed cabin front from the outside. My assembly was definitely less than perfect, as you can see from this close-up, but hopefully it won't look too bad from a normal distance. The rest of the cabin walls need to be done similarly based on the diagrams on the back of the sheet and the verbal instructions on the front of the sheet. This is the simpler of the two cabin ends with just a window. The other end has the door. Here are those parts with all of the casting pieces removed. And here's my best attempt at gluing the frame to the timber. By the way, I used precision poly cement with a fine metal applicator. The instructions actually suggest using liquid poly. Actually, I think there were a couple of places where I did use liquid. Here's that cabin end with its Type 19 and Type 20 window frames in place. The Type 19 seem to fit better here. Here's the diagram for the other, more complex cabin end. It's fairly similar, except that the door adds a little complexity, needing to itself be assembled from 3 parts. Here are the parts for that end other than the glazing pieces, which again need to be cut to size, with the door requiring a special glazing piece. The timber panel is glued into the door, and the door window is glazed. The frame glues to the front of the timber as before. Care needs to be taken to get all of the bits of the frame neatly in place. Then again, Type 19 and Type 20 window frames are glued in place and glazed, and the door is glued in place. The Type 19 window again didn't seem to fit quite properly here. If that was due to some error of mine, I don't know what it was. I wasn't clear whether the door was supposed to be glued from the inside or the outside, but experimenting seemed to indicate that it fitted better from the inside. This is the diagram for the last cabin panel, the back of the cabin. These were clearly the right parts for the timber and the frame. I had some trouble locating the part for the stone insert, as no part really seemed to match the diagram well. I concluded that the intended part must be that at top right here, even though it looks rather different from the diagram. Here's that stone part with the timber and the frame already assembled. The instructions say that the bottom of the stone part should be level with the bottom of the frame, although it barely seemed to be long enough. So here are all 4 cabin walls assembled. The windows look a bit wonky, but that was the best that I could do. Now those walls are glued together. It's actually the mitered edges on the ends of the frames that fit together at the corners, so you'd better make sure that you smooth those down, removing the remains of the sprue attachment points. Here are all 4 walls glued together. I switched to working on a piece of foam board here to get a flatter surface on which to square up the walls. Here are the paper parts for the interior. These need to be carefully cut out. And here are those parts cut out. There are no specific instructions with respect to these, so you just have to figure out by looking at them where they're supposed to go. I glued the paper parts in place using rocket card glue. It was a bit of an iffy process, as the backs of the plastic parts weren't at all flat, making it quite awkward to glue a flat paper part in place. Some of the paper parts also didn't seem to quite fit around the windows, etc. in the plastic parts, and a bit of trimming was required. Here's that paper part fitted around the window after trimming. This paper part was presumably intended to go here, under the window next to the door. Then there was another paper piece to go round the top of the door. The piece for the fireplace was presumably intended to go on top of the piece for the back wall, lined up with the stone panel on the outside. There was a tiny paper piece for a notice. Notice was the only word that was actually legible on this. I wasn't sure where it was supposed to go, as nothing similar seemed to appear anywhere in the instructions or illustrations. I eventually concluded that the most reasonable place for the notice was on the door of the box. These are the stone panels for the lower part of the signal box. The instructions treat these as part of the base, which confused me a bit at first. I cleaned their edges up using an emery board. I find emery boards very helpful for cleaning up plastic parts. I just buy the ones for manicure from the dollar store. The stone parts glued together with mitered edges at their corners. I'm not entirely sure that I got all of the pieces the right way up, although I did try to put them the way that looked better. The kit comes with a green base piece representing a chunk of ground around the box. I wasn't entirely sure whether or not I wanted to use this, but I checked the fit of the stone base of the box against the ground piece. I glued the stone base to the bottom of the box assembly with the cabin floor in between. The instructions said to glue the cabin floor to the stone and then to glue on the cabin walls, but I found it very hard to tell how the floor should fit onto the stone base. So I glued the stone base, the floor and the cabin walls all together in a single operation so that I could get the fit right. I tried that assembly again on the ground piece, but I didn't glue it. I glued the 3 pieces for the steps up to the door together. The top didn't seem to quite come out even, but I let the glue dry before sanding the top square with an emery board. This is the green plastic sprue for the barge boards. It also has various other parts on it, but these don't seem to be needed for this kit. Presumably Ratio simplified things by making a single sprue that would work with this kit and also with other signal box kits, apparently requiring railings round an exterior platform. I separated out and cleaned up the barge boards, again quite a fiddly process. These are the parts for the roof tiling and the ridge tiles. The ends of the roof tiling parts fit into grooves in the barge board parts, a fairly fiddly fit. Once one end was done, I did the other before the glue on the first fully dried. Even then I don't believe that I got things perfectly lined up. The gap at the top is okay, as the ridge tiles will cover that. I tried the ridge tiles in place just to make sure that things fitted okay, but I didn't glue them at this point as I felt they should be painted a different colour. I tried the box with the steps on the ground piece, but again not glued at this point. These are the parts for the chimney. And here are those parts off the sprue and basically cleaned up. The sides of the chimney glue together along mitered edges. Rather fiddly to glue these small pieces together and get them square. There seemed to be an extra row of bricks on the inner chimney part. I left it on at first as I thought there might be some reason for this, but I ended up removing it eventually as this seemed to be required in order to fit the chimney to the roof. The little square frame is supposed to fit around the outside of the chimney, and I had a devil of a time getting it to go on, requiring much awkward filing. Then the top fits over the ends of the sides of the chimney, which also required some filing. I painted the inside of the chimney pot black. These are the small parts for the fire buckets, their hanging frame and the door lamp. Here are the parts for the bucket hanging frame separated. I was afraid that it would be hard to get the hooks into the holes. Actually, the problem was the reverse. The holes were too big for the hooks, making it hard to get the hooks to stay in place level. I presumed that these small circular pieces were meant to go into the tops of the buckets. I tried to put them in place with tweezers, but one shot out of my tweezers and I couldn't find it, so I used a bit of white tack to fill in the third bucket. Then the handles needed to be prepared and glued to the buckets. Working with these parts was very tricky, as they were so small and awkwardly shaped that it was almost impossible to hold them. I did my best to attach the handles more or less sensibly to the buckets. Here are the ridge tiles back from being spray painted with a brick red colour. Now I glued the ridge tiles in place, completing the roof. These are the parts for the lamp over the signal box door, again hard to clean up as it's very difficult to hold them. Here's that lamp assembled as best as I could do it. The chimney is glued in place on the back of the roof. At this point I took the box up to try it on the layout. Mainly I was trying to decide what to do about the ground base. I definitely didn't see having it green like that, so I was either going to omit it entirely or refinish it to better blend in somehow. I painted the detail parts, the fire buckets, their hangers and the lamp. Not the neatest of jobs, but hopefully it will pass from a distance. Here are the parts for the gutters and downpipes on a grey sprue. I wasn't too sure what that other part was supposed to be. These were some of the most delicate parts, so requiring extra care in cutting them from the sprue. I glued the gutters to the sides of the roof. I had to cut down the attachment bracket pieces on these gutters, as they were too long, and if I'd left them as they were, there would have been a sizable gap between the edge of the roof and the gutter, which would have made the gutter not much use for catching rain. Then I glued the downpipes in place from the gutters at the corners of the box. The downpipes, as provided, were quite a bit too long and they needed to be cut to length. The instructions did say that this needed to be done, presumably because the same pipes would be supplied with another kit with a higher box. Here's the other downpipe at the corner by the box door. These parts came out of the centre of the ground piece. The parts at left make an oil drum on a stand. The parts at right are, I think, intended as part of a coal staith. I glued the drum halves together. I figured that perhaps this grey part was meant to be the back of the coal staith, although there was nothing in the instructions to support this. I glued the legs to the oil drum and the grey piece to the staith ends, to which it did seem to fit. I had no idea what this piece might be for. Thinking about it, I believe it must be meant to be some sort of external platform outside a different type of signal box. The instructions provided this template for bending handrails for the steps from the piece of brass wire supplied. I did my best to make two pieces matching the template. I glued the steps to the box below the door. This was the best I could come up with in terms of the handrails. I drilled holes on either side of the door with a pin vise and then superglued the bases of the rails to the bottom step. I glued the lamp over the door and I glued the hanger for the fire buckets in place. I hung the buckets on the hanger. They hung on the hooks fine by their handles and so didn't need gluing. They do seem to be rather large buckets for OO scale. They'd be about 2 feet across the top. For the ground base, I painted the paths with glue and then sprinkled on mixed fine ballast. Then I removed the excess ballast after the glue dried and painted the rest of the surface grey to match my shelves. Here's the assembled box on that base. The position of the paths seems a bit odd, but I put them where they were precast into the base. I painted the oil tank and the coal staith. I printed a name for the signal box on my PC and stuck it in place. In case you don't catch the reference, Hatley was the station in the British comedy series Oh, Dr. Beeching. Hatley, change here for Bustin and Wenstead. I love that show. Even though it is set in BR days, I have it on DVD and I've watched all of the episodes umpteen times. And finally, I placed the box on the layout, next to the Hornby water tower outside the Hornby station. I put the oil drum over behind the box. I didn't use the coal staith. Maybe I should have painted the handrails for the steps. But generally I'm quite pleased with the result, and as I said at the start, I'd be happy recommending this kit so long as the complexity and fiddliness doesn't put you off.